The Cult of the Wounded, Youth, Victimhood, and the Death of Resilience. There's a strange new religion in the modern world, and its altar is the wound. Its followers don't kneel before gods or kings, but before their own injuries. The sacrament is confession, not of sin, but of suffering. To suffer is to be pure. To be offended is to be alive. We used to call this empathy. Now it has become a hierarchy. The more one bleeds, the more one belongs. In the old world, people sought meaning through labor, faith, or love. Now they seek it through grievance. The wound has become a form of identity, a passport to moral legitimacy. And nowhere is this faith more fervent than among the young, those born into a time of peace, abundance, and infinite connectivity, yet convinced that they inhabit a cruel and collapsing world. They have inherited the comfort their ancestors fought for, but comfort, left unchecked, turns to decay. A society that forgets struggle breeds children allergic to reality. They do not rebel against tyranny, as Orwell once feared. They rebel against discomfort. A raised eyebrow is oppression. A differing opinion is violence. They do not storm the Bastille. They storm the comment section. It's not their fault entirely. They were told from birth that safety was sacred, that harm must be eliminated, that their feelings were maps of truth. It was a kind of psychological overprotection, a velvet tyranny. Their parents built fortresses of comfort, governments padded them with laws, schools wrapped them in trigger warnings. And now, when life inevitably scratches the skin, it feels like an existential wound. Orwell once imagined a boot stamping on a human face forever. We have invented something subtler, a pillow pressed over the human spirit. Softness masquerading as care, protection disguising itself as compassion. The result is not liberation, but dependency, a quiet paralysis, a learned helplessness dressed as morality. Jung might say that when we deny the darkness, it grows teeth. And so by shielding youth from pain, we have fed their shadows in secret. The repressed wound becomes the only source of vitality left, a kind of psychic rebellion against the sterility of safety. And so the young cling to the wound, polishing it like an heirloom, displaying it in the agora of social media. Their suffering becomes performance, their fragility a badge of belonging. Nietzsche would laugh, though not unkindly. He warned that when strength is no longer admired, weakness becomes weaponized. And so here we are, in an age where to be wounded is to be right, and to be whole is to be suspect. The strong are accused of arrogance, the weak claim the moral throne. It's a strange inversion of nobility, the transvaluation of values in real time. What was once tragedy is now currency. Frankl, who survived the camps, believed meaning came from choosing one's response to suffering. Now, meaning comes from broadcasting it. Pain, once endured silently, is now the ticket to visibility. Suffering has been democratized, commodified, even gamified. Every post, every confession, every tear-streaked testimony becomes proof of existence. I hurt, therefore I am. Fromm would call this an escape from freedom, the fear of self-determination dressed as sensitivity. Freedom demands responsibility. Victimhood promises absolution. It's easier to be injured than accountable. The victim owes nothing, risks nothing, forgives nothing. They live inside a moral insurance policy, untouchable, unquestionable, adored for their pain. Freud would recognize the neurosis, the wound as substitute for will. The ego, deprived of purpose, finds solace in its scars. The young, robbed of hardship, invent their own. They self-diagnose, self-therapize, and self-advertise their fragility until it becomes their only identity. They do not want healing. Healing would erase the only thing that makes them visible. And yet, beneath the irony, there is real suffering here, the quiet ache of disconnection. When every human emotion is labeled trauma, when every disagreement is oppression, the soul loses its sense of proportion. Jung called this inflation, the ego swelling to fill the space where meaning should be. Without gods, without metaphysics, without community, the self expands until it bursts. We mistake noise for depth, outrage for conviction, empathy for truth. We are drowning in sentiment, starving for meaning. Orwell once said that the great enemy of clear language is insincerity. In our age, the enemy is comfort. The young are fluent in the language of injury, but mute in the language of endurance. They can name every microaggression, but not their own longing. They mistake surveillance for solidarity, hashtags for healing, confession for connection. It is not that they lack empathy. They have too much of it, but it is turned inward, looping endlessly around the self like a snake devouring its tail. They have been raised in a moral economy where power is sin and suffering is salvation. They are haunted by ghosts of injustice they never met, ashamed of privileges they never asked for, desperate to be absolved by suffering they haven't earned. It's not ideology, it's identity theater. And behind the curtain stands the quiet figure of the state, smiling softly, happy to rule a population too fragile to question, too sensitive to rebel, too busy nursing its wounds to notice the bars of its own cage. The psychology of the wound. Every civilization invents a story about pain. Ours decided that it must be avoided at all costs. The ancient world built its virtues around endurance. Ours builds its institutions around protection. We do not climb the mountain. We design a safer treadmill. Jung might say that the psyche begins to atrophy when it is spared too much struggle. Pain in its healthy form is the tutor of depth. When it is never met, the shadow grows restless. What was once an inner warning becomes a full-time identity, a kind of emotional bureaucracy that regulates every encounter. Nietzsche saw this long before it arrived. A civilization that forgets how to affirm life will start to sanctify its injuries. If the heroic cannot survive, the sentimental will rule. So we build temples to the self's minor bruises and call it compassion. We confuse being safe with being good. Freud would describe it differently. He would notice how the forbidden energy of aggression, when repressed, returns disguised as moral passion. We cannot fight dragons anymore, so we fight tone, phrasing, the inflection of a sentence. Every slight becomes a symbolic war because the instincts have nowhere honest to go. Fromm warned that people flee from freedom precisely because it terrifies them. Responsibility is a lonely country. It is easier to live inside the warm consensus of hurt, where nobody must act alone, only react together. We call this empathy, but it often functions as a pact of avoidance. I will protect your wound if you protect mine. Frankl, who learned the limits of despair firsthand, would tell us that meaning arises not from escaping pain, but from giving it a direction. When pain loses purpose, it festers. We begin to curate it, display it, tend it like a fragile plant. But meaning, unlike pity, demands risk. It demands that we step beyond the wound and ask what it was trying to teach. Arendt would notice the political consequence. A people who define themselves by injury are easily ruled. They ask not for freedom, but for reassurance. They will trade thought for belonging, dissent for safety. It is a quiet form of totalitarianism, not the iron boot Orwell described, but the soft captivity of perpetual care. Look closely and you can see how this logic seeps into language. We speak of safe spaces, as if words themselves were bullets. We replace dialogue with declarations, therapy with theater. The vocabulary of trauma migrates into every corner of life until ordinary conflict is mistaken for catastrophe. And yet, the human spirit still strains against the cushions, and every young person who secretly wonders whether they are more than the sum of their sensitivities, the old fire flickers. They long to be tested, to prove that courage still exists, even in an age that discourages it. They sense that the self cannot be built entirely from protection, that one must venture into the weather to find a spine. Perhaps this is the paradox of the wound. It hurts because it wants to heal. It calls for attention, yes, but also for transformation. The tragedy of our moment is not that people feel pain, it is that they are taught to build a home inside it. They mistake the symptom for the soul. The death of resilience. There comes a point in every civilization where the desire to protect life begins to suffocate it. The air grows thick with kindness, but it is a kindness without backbone, a sweetness that seeps into the moral lungs until they forget how to breathe. Orwell once imagined a world of surveillance and slogans. We got something subtler. We monitor one another not with cameras, but with concern. We speak of safety, of care, of sensitivity, words so gentle they hide their iron core. The tyranny of comfort wears a soft voice and a smile. In 1984, Big Brother demanded obedience. In our version, the algorithm simply suggests it, softly, incessantly, until our outrage sounds suspiciously like marketing. And the citizens comply, not from fear of punishment, but from the sweeter fear of exclusion. We do not burn heretics, we ghost them. Hannah Arendt would have seen the danger. She warned that evil in modernity no longer arrives with a snarl, but with a spreadsheet. Today, banality has become benevolence. The bureaucrats of care, the engineers of safety, all work in the name of protection. But in shielding the human being from every discomfort, they also shield them from moral growth. The muscles of the soul, courage, irony, forgiveness, cannot survive without resistance. Nietzsche would laugh, though not unkindly. He told us that what does not kill me makes me stronger. But we have edited that line for our times. What does not kill me must be canceled. We no longer strive to transcend suffering. We strive to curate it. We display our pain like medals and confuse vulnerability with virtue. Freud might have called this the civilization of neurosis. When the instincts are denied their natural expression, they twist inward. Aggression becomes anxiety, desire becomes guilt, and the mind caught between repression and expression begins to cannibalize itself. The result is not peace, but paralysis. Jung would recognize this paralysis as the refusal of the shadow. Every age has its darkness, and this one hides behind pastel slogans. We are so afraid of being cruel that we have forgotten how to be strong. So we exile conflict, we censor irony, we outlaw risk, and then wonder why the soul feels so anemic. Frankl, who endured the unendurable, told us that meaning is found not in comfort, but in the confrontation with suffering. He wrote, "The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." But what becomes of a culture that abolishes circumstances altogether, where the greatest tragedy is a mean comment and the deepest crisis is boredom? We lose not just our resilience, we lose the conditions that make meaning possible. Erich Fromm might say that this is the ultimate escape from freedom. We surrendered the chaos of choice for the anesthesia of conformity. We learned to whisper our dissent, to apologize before we speak. We no longer need a ministry of truth, we have internalized it. Our screens and our self-images have become the censors we most trust. So what remains of the self when pain is forbidden and disagreement is impolite? A kind of moral hologram, visible, polished, performative, but weightless. We parade our empathy like a currency, unaware that empathy without courage is sentimentality, and sentimentality without honesty is decay. Resilience, in its true form, is not the absence of pain. It is the dialogue with it. It is the stubborn, defiant act of standing upright in a storm and saying, "This is mine to face." It cannot be engineered by policy or preserved by comfort. It must be chosen again and again by the individual soul. And here lies the quiet hope. For beneath the noise of grievance, beneath the theater of perpetual offense, the human spirit still stirs. It stirs in the artist who dares to offend for the sake of truth, in the student who reads dangerous books, in the citizen who refuses to tweet their conscience for applause. These are the new heretics, the ones who would rather be whole than safe. Perhaps that is the final message of this age of wounds, that safety, like power, is never neutral. It can protect, or it can suffocate. The challenge is to learn, as Frankl did, to give our suffering meaning before it gives us none. Because life will always hurt. It is not a glitch in the system, it is the pulse of existence itself. To live without pain would be to live without growth, without love, without art. A life that never risks heartbreak will never taste awe. So perhaps the task now is not to heal the wound, but to outgrow it, to treat pain not as identity, but as invitation, to remember that fragility and strength are not enemies, but stages in the same becoming. Orwell feared a boot stamping on a human face forever. He could not have foreseen the opposite horror, a pillow pressed gently over the human spirit, whispering, "Shh, don't struggle, it's for your own good." And that, in the end, is how the human soul is lost, not in flames, but in comfort, not through oppression, but through overprotection. The end of resilience is not pain, it is the absence of it. And when a generation forgets how to suffer with dignity, it forgets how to live with meaning.